They didn't just torture bodies, they turned minds against themselves. The year was 1323. In the heart of Toulouse, a crowd surged like a living tide, their voices rising in a deafening roar that echoed between the stone walls of the medieval square. At the center of this storm stood Maria Santos, stripped of every garment, every symbol of dignity. Her bare skin shone pale beneath the morning sun, her body trembling in the cold air. Around her, thousands of her neighbors, the very people she had grown up alongside, traded with, prayed beside, now screamed for her destruction. But what Maria faced that day went beyond the threat of death. In fact, death would have been an act of mercy. She begged for it, tears streaking her dirt-stained face, her voice hoarse from pleading. She asked to be burned alive, believing that the fire's searing agony would be a release. The church refused. What they intended for her was far more insidious, a punishment that reached past the flesh to crush the soul. By the end of her ordeal, Maria Santos would no longer simply be a woman awaiting judgment, she would become a shell of a person, hollowed out by forces she could not fight. This story will change the way you see the past forever. And if you think this is dark, you haven't seen anything yet. So keep watching, because there are secrets coming that you won't believe. For centuries, this story was hidden, erased from sermons and records alike. Modern historians who stumbled across fragments of it in dusty archives were unsettled by what they read. Many chose silence rather than risk exposing just how deep the darkness in medieval Christianity truly went. To understand how a single human being could be reduced so completely, we must journey backward in time, to the origins of the system that consumed Maria's life. Our path leads to the year 1184, when the very definition of salvation was twisted into a tool of domination. Picture Europe in that era, cities encircled by thick stone walls, the air heavy with the smoke of tallow candles and the tolling of church bells. Faith ruled every aspect of life. A single accusation of heresy was enough to unravel entire families, to bring down merchants, scholars, even noble houses. At the center of this tightening net of fear stood Pope Lucius III. That year, he placed his seal upon one of the most terrifying documents in medieval history, a papal bull known as Ad Abelandum. With one stroke of a quill, the Church gained nearly limitless power to seek out and punish those who dared to think differently. Anyone suspected of heresy could be hunted, captured, and purified, no matter their rank or wealth. But here is where common history lessons fail us. The Inquisition's ultimate goal was not the swift execution of heretics. Death, in the eyes of the inquisitors, was far too quick. It ended suffering in a single moment. It carried the risk of martyrdom, allowing the condemned to escape with their beliefs intact. Instead, the Church envisioned something far more chilling, a slow, methodical unmaking of the human spirit. This was not justice. It was not even revenge. It was a carefully designed system to erase the very core of a person's identity while leaving their body alive to suffer through it. The men who served this system wore the robes of priests, but their work resembled the craft of psychological tormentors more than spiritual guides. They discovered that a human being could be completely destroyed without a single drop of blood being spilled. To achieve this, they didn't need whips or chains at first. All they required was absolute control over the most fragile part of a person, their sense of self. By stripping away every shred of dignity, by turning communities against the accused, by forcing them to watch their own reputation burn before their eyes, the Inquisition perfected a punishment more feared than the stake itself. This was the weapon that awaited Maria Santos in that square in Toulouse. And this is why she prayed for the fire, because the fire, at least, was honest. It ended. The Inquisition had a name for their most sinister invention. Purification through humiliation. At first glance, it sounded almost noble, a spiritual cleansing, a path to redemption. But beneath this holy language lay a method of control so perverse, so calculated, that it could twist a person's very sense of reality. The concept was terrifyingly simple. If you could make someone feel so ashamed of their very existence that they truly believed they deserved punishment, you didn't just control their body, you claimed their soul. It wasn't about visible wounds or shattered bones. It was about breaking the mind so completely that the victim willingly participated in their own destruction. The inquisitors were masters of this dark art. They didn't merely demand confessions, they demanded complete psychological surrender. It wasn't enough for a victim to say, "I am guilty." No, the church wanted them to believe it, to feel it deep within their bones, until they were thanking their tormentors for the privilege of suffering. Their goal was terrifying in its precision, to turn human beings into living symbols of obedience, living warnings of what happens when you dare to resist. Over time, they perfected a machine of humiliation so devastating that its victims would often beg for death rather than endure another day under its crushing weight. But death, to the church, was too merciful. Why grant release when you could make someone suffer for decades, not just privately, but in full view of their entire community? The Inquisition had discovered that the most efficient form of torture was not a rack or a blade, but a weapon aimed directly at the human psyche. And the most horrifying part? They convinced entire communities that this slow, methodical destruction was an act of divine love. To understand this nightmare, imagine waking up every morning knowing that everyone you pass on the street will instantly recognize you as damned. There is no way to hide, no way to start over, no way to escape. That was the purpose of the San Benito. On the surface, it was merely a garment, a coarse yellow robe. But in reality, it was a walking proclamation of your supposed guilt, a billboard of eternal damnation. Painted on the chest were vivid, terrifying images, demons clawing at your soul, flames devouring your body, grotesque symbols of hell's punishment. And in bold, unmistakable letters, your name. Everyone who saw you would know exactly who you were, exactly what crime you had been accused of, exactly what fate awaited anyone who questioned the church. The psychological impact was devastating. From sunrise to sunset, every step you took reminded you, and everyone else, that you were an outcast. Children mocked you. Merchants refused to sell you bread. Former friends crossed the street to avoid you. Even family members looked away, too ashamed, or too terrified, to be seen standing beside you. You weren't just living with shame. You were shame, made flesh and forced to walk among the living. Inquisitorial archives from Toulouse reveal just how widespread this punishment became. Between the years 1307 and 1323, they recorded 847 individuals sentenced to wear the San Benito for life. Of those, 312 took their own lives within the first year. The Church's response? They refused to grant these souls burial in consecrated ground. Worse still, they extended the punishment to the families of the dead, forcing them to wear San Benitos as well, entire households branded as cursed. Think about the psychological warfare at play here. You weren't merely punished. You were transformed into a weapon aimed at your own neighbors. Every time someone saw you staggering through the marketplace in your yellow robe, they were reminded of the church's unblinking gaze. It whispered to them, "We are watching. This could happen to you." The most insidious part was that people eventually accepted this as mercy. The inquisitors would say, "We could have burned them alive." Instead, they claimed to offer a chance at redemption, lifelong penance instead of the flames. And after months of relentless psychological conditioning, many victims believed it. They thanked their tormentors for sparing their lives. They defended the very system that had destroyed their reputations, their relationships, their humanity. Maria Santos, the woman whose story began this journey, wore her San Benito for 14 agonizing years. 14 years of mockery and isolation. 14 years of children throwing stones. 14 years of being turned away from shops and inns, forced to sleep in doorways like a stray animal. No one would risk sheltering a demon. When she finally died in 1337, alone and forgotten, the church recorded her passing not as a tragedy, but as a victory. They wrote in their ledgers that her soul had been purified through suffering. But in truth, Maria's story was only the beginning. The San Benito was a slow death, a punishment stretched across a lifetime. And yet, in the hierarchy of humiliation, it was just the first step. Because what came next made the San Benito seem almost merciful. If the robe was a sentence of daily torment, the church's next creation was a public spectacle of annihilation, the auto da fe. Imagine a stadium filled with thousands, a scene as grand and chaotic as any festival or tournament. But instead of celebrating heroes, the crowd gathered to watch neighbors, friends, even family members systematically stripped of every last shred of dignity. The air would tremble with anticipation. Not for games. Not for sport. But for the destruction of human souls. Here's the truth no history book dares to emphasize. The auto da fe, or act of faith, was never truly about justice. It wasn't about spiritual redemption either. It was about terror, raw, calculated terror that seeped into every corner of society. The church discovered something chilling: if you could make one person's destruction spectacular enough, if you could humiliate them so completely that it burned itself into the memory of every witness, you didn't just control the accused, you controlled everyone who watched. A single victim could keep thousands obedient. The ritual began in the darkest hours before dawn. Prison cells creaked open one by one. The accused were dragged out, their bodies trembling, their eyes dazed from days or weeks in darkness. Their clothes were ripped away, leaving them utterly exposed, stripped of the last fragile barrier between themselves and the crowd awaiting them. As dawn broke, they were paraded through the streets like trophies of conquest. The silence of the early morning was soon replaced by a rising chorus of voices, whispers, then shouts, then a deafening roar as the mob gathered to witness the spectacle. The victims weren't just there to be judged. They were there to perform. And this is where the true cruelty revealed itself. The accused weren't merely forced to confess to heresy. That alone wasn't enough for the Inquisition's purposes. No, they were compelled to invent the most vile, degrading sins imaginable and claim them as truth. Their own mouths became the weapons used to destroy them. Historical records, like those from the trial of Pedro de la Caballeria in 1485, reveal the depths of this psychological torment. Pedro was forced to confess before the entire city that he had lain with demons, feasted on human flesh, and desecrated sacred relics in acts too grotesque to speak aloud. None of it was true. But under the relentless pressure, under the weight of countless accusing eyes, even he began to doubt himself. The lies started to feel real. The crowd was not a passive audience. They were participants. The church encouraged them to hurl rotten food, to spit in the faces of the condemned, to scream the foulest insults. Every gesture, every cruel laugh, every handful of filth thrown at the prisoners made the humiliation complete. The genius of this cruelty was that the victim's destruction became a shared event. The accused stood there naked and defenseless, confessing to crimes they never committed, while the very people they had once lived among joined in the desecration. It was not just torture, it was community theater, with the church as director and the crowd as actors. And here's the most perverse twist of all: when the prisoners had finished their false confessions, they were forced to thank the Inquisition for its mercy. Imagine standing before thousands, trembling, sobbing, broken, and having to give gratitude to those who orchestrated your annihilation. Hours passed this way, each moment grinding away at the victim's spirit. Finally, when they were nothing more than hollow shells, the inquisitors offered them a choice, or rather, the illusion of one. They could renounce everything they had ever believed, betray their friends and family, and pledge eternal service to the church. In return, their lives would be spared. This was the final stroke of psychological genius. After being dismantled piece by piece, many clung desperately to this chance at redemption. They would agree to anything, betray anyone, just to make the humiliation stop. Pedro de la Caballeria survived his auto da fe. But according to his daughter's testimony, survival came at a terrible price. For the rest of his life, he was haunted by the phantom gaze of the crowd. He would wake in the middle of the night screaming, convinced that thousands of unseen eyes were still watching him, judging him. 2 years later, he died in a feverish delirium. His final words, recorded by the church, were an apology, not to his family, not to his God, but to the inquisitors, for not having suffered enough. And yet, even this wasn't the Church's most devastating weapon. As horrifying as the auto da fe was, there remained a darker tool in the inquisitors' arsenal. A technique so feared that even hardened interrogators whispered its name with unease: La Garrocha, the breaker of souls. This was not mere physical torture. It was psychological warfare disguised as interrogation, a method designed to force victims to shatter their own faith with their own words. Here is how it unfolded. The prisoner would be stripped naked once again and hoisted high into the air by ropes tied around their wrists. Heavy weights were fastened to their ankles, stretching their bodies to the breaking point. As their joints slowly began to separate, the physical agony alone would have been unbearable. But this was only the beginning. The true horror lay in what the victim was compelled to do while suspended in that state. They weren't allowed to suffer in silence. They were forced to speak, to blaspheme, to curse everything they had ever held sacred. Their God. Their family. Their deepest beliefs. The Directorium Inquisitorum, written by Nicolau Eimerich, describes this process with chilling precision. It was never random brutality. Every step was deliberate, calculated to produce maximum psychological devastation. The pain was designed to weaken the body. The words, however, were meant to annihilate the spirit. A victim could endure agony and still cling to faith in silence, but to be made to actively denounce it, to participate in one's own spiritual destruction, that was a torment far beyond the physical. By the time the ropes were finally cut and the victims collapsed to the floor, many were no longer the same people they had been hours before. Their bodies were broken, but their souls had been carefully dismantled, piece by piece, by their own lips. Imagine the scene for just a moment. You're hanging by your wrists, your shoulders on fire, tendons stretched to the breaking point. Every nerve in your body screams for release. And as the physical pain sears through you, a voice demands that you curse everything you've ever held sacred. You are forced to speak the unthinkable, to say aloud that your mother was vile and worthless, that your children deserve damnation, that you have turned your back on your God and pledged yourself to darkness. Each word burns deeper than the ropes cutting into your skin. It's not just pain anymore. It's annihilation. This was the diabolical brilliance of La Garrocha. Even if you survived the ordeal, even if you were eventually released from the dungeon, you could never escape what had been forced from your own lips. Those blasphemous words would echo inside your mind for the rest of your life. Every prayer you tried to whisper would be drowned out by the memory of your own voice screaming curses into the darkness. The Church didn't merely torture bodies, it made its victims torture themselves. They turned the human soul against itself, twisting faith into a weapon of destruction. La Garrocha wasn't about extracting truth. It was about obliterating identity, leaving only a hollow shell of a person behind. Church records reveal the devastating effectiveness of this method. La Garrocha had a 97% success rate in obtaining full confessions. But these weren't true confessions of guilt. They were desperate capitulations, the last defense of minds pushed to the brink of madness. The victims would confess to anything, to crimes real or imagined, just to stop the torment of hearing their own voices condemn everything they once loved. It was psychological warfare of the most intimate kind, carried out in sacred chambers under the guise of salvation. One testimony, hidden deep within the archives for centuries, comes from a man named Johannes Mercator, who endured La Garrocha in 1289. He survived, but the man who emerged was unrecognizable. "I cannot pray anymore," his account reads. "Each time I try to speak to God, I hear my own voice cursing him. They did not only break my body, they broke my soul." Johann spent his remaining days rocking silently in his cell, whispering the blasphemies he had been forced to utter, over and over, until even the guards averted their eyes. He was living proof that a person could be destroyed from the inside out. But there was a fate even more horrifying than La Garrocha. For those who still refused to break completely, who somehow clung to a shred of inner defiance, the Church reserved a punishment so cruel that even some inquisitors whispered about it with dread. They called it mercy. And that was the most twisted lie of all. After months of relentless psychological and physical torment, victims were offered what seemed like salvation, reconciliation with the church. It sounded like forgiveness, a chance to start anew. But in reality, it was the cruelest punishment of all. A reconciliator was someone who had confessed, repented, and been officially forgiven. On paper, they were free. Legally alive. But in every meaningful sense, they were dead to society, spiritual ghosts, forever marked. Here's what reconciliation truly meant. The moment you accepted it, your life was shattered. You were permanently banned from every honorable profession. No merchant would hire you. No guild would admit you. No school would allow you to teach. The only work you could perform was the most degrading manual labor, cleaning streets, digging graves, hauling refuse. Marriage? Only with special permission from the church, and such permission was almost never granted. Even your children were punished. They were forbidden from most trades and positions, forced to live under the shadow of your supposed sins. The church ensured that your disgrace would taint your bloodline for generations. But the final stroke of cruelty was this. You had to thank them for it. You were required to attend special masses where you stood before the community, confessed your eternal unworthiness, and praised the church for its divine mercy. You were also obligated to act as an informant, reporting anyone you suspected of harboring heretical thoughts, even friends or family members. You became a walking advertisement for church power, living proof of what awaited those who disobeyed. Your very existence was a sermon on submission and fear. Spanish Inquisition records reveal the staggering scale of this practice. Between 1478 and 1530, more than 125,000 people were sentenced to reconciliation. Of those, conservative estimates suggest that 30,000 took their own lives within just 5 years of their so-called mercy. The psychological impact on entire communities was catastrophic. Modern psychologists might describe it as epidemic depression. In the city of Córdoba, suicide rates rose by over 400% during the peak years of the Inquisition. In Seville, entire families fled their homes to avoid being branded as reconciliators. The church's forgiveness was so devastating that people chose death over the unbearable weight of continued existence. Imagine the horror of living like this. Each morning, you wake up knowing that you are alive only because the church allows it. You can't work, can't marry, can't dream of a normal life. Your neighbors glance at you with suspicion, as if you carry a contagious disease. Your children inherit not just your name, but your shame. And yet, you must smile and give thanks. You must kneel and praise the very institution that condemned you to this living death. This was the final triumph of the Inquisition, not merely to kill the body, but to own the soul so completely that even in despair, it called itself blessed. In the end, the system began to collapse under the sheer weight of its own cruelty. For centuries, the Inquisition had wielded humiliation like a sacred weapon, but by the early 1600s, cracks began to show. Entire regions were left economically ruined. So many skilled artisans, merchants, and intellectuals had been either reconciled into uselessness or had fled in fear that there were too few left to keep society functioning. Shops stood empty. Workshops fell silent. The once thriving towns of Spain and its territories became stagnant, their growth strangled by an atmosphere of suspicion and despair. The church had built a climate so steeped in terror that innovation withered and productivity collapsed. Fear kept people obedient, but it also made them paralyzed. The very tool meant to ensure control was slowly choking the life out of the world it ruled. The final blow, however, came not from foreign armies or political rivals, but from the victims themselves. Those who had endured reconciliation, the reconciliados, began to meet in secret. Huddled in cellars, hidden behind false walls, they shared their stories. They began to document the techniques used against them, recording the psychological strategies the church had wielded with such precision. They couldn't fight openly. The price of defiance was still too high. But they could preserve the truth for future generations. Every whispered testimony, Every smuggled manuscript was an act of resistance, proof that even in the heart of darkness, human dignity still flickered like a fragile flame. By the dawn of the 1700s, the tide of public opinion began to shift. Generations of secret records and whispered accounts had spread through towns and cities, exposing the church's merciful punishments for what they truly were. Sophisticated psychological warfare, designed not to heal but to break the human spirit while keeping the body alive to suffer. What had once been celebrated as divine justice was now recognized as cruelty in its purest form. The very last reconciliado died in 1834, over 300 years after this system of humiliation first began. Her name was Isabella Morales, and her life was the ultimate symbol of what reconciliation truly meant. For 67 long years, she lived as a social ghost, legally alive, yet erased from her community, forever branded by the Church's mercy. She died alone, but her existence was a living testament to the depths of human suffering that had been masked as salvation. When we look back on the history of torture, certain images often come to mind: the rack, the stake, the Iron Maiden. But the greatest cruelty the Church ever devised was none of these. It wasn't a physical device at all. Instead, they built a system, an invisible machine of psychological destruction so effective that countless victims begged for death, praying for release from another day of so-called mercy. Conservative estimates suggest that more than 125,000 lives were directly destroyed through these methods of humiliation and control. But that number tells only part of the story. When you include their families, their children, and the countless communities scarred by fear and suspicion, the true toll reaches millions of souls. Perhaps the most chilling truth is this: the techniques of the Inquisition did not vanish when its flames were extinguished. They evolved. Today, modern authoritarian regimes still use many of the same tactics: public shaming, forced confessions, and social isolation, to keep populations obedient. The tools have changed. Instead of robes and plazas, they use cameras and digital platforms. But the principles remain exactly the same. The architecture of fear is timeless. This journey has taken us through one of the darkest chapters in human history, a world where faith was weaponized and mercy became indistinguishable from cruelty. It serves as a warning: when power is left unchecked, even the most sacred ideals can be twisted into instruments of oppression. The story of the reconciliados reminds us that human dignity is fragile. Once broken, it leaves scars that last for centuries. As we walk through modern streets, surrounded by the freedoms we often take for granted, we must remember those whose lives were shattered by systems built to control through fear. Their suffering was not in vain, so long as we never forget what was done to them. Because history has shown us, time and again, that those who forget are doomed to repeat it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next videos.